So, hello everyone, good morning. I'm Carmen von Rohr, Content and Digital Manager at CRF, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I think we've all got the hang more or less of Zoom by now, so any questions, please do let Athena know. She's supporting the call from a technical perspective. A couple of things to mention on the format of today's call and some guiding principles. First, please note that we have defaulted to mute for all participants. So when you want to speak, please take yourself off mute and then pop yourself back on when you're finished. Second, a quick preview of how this Zoom will go. In part one, I will give a short presentation on the findings from our just released research report. In part two, myself and our special guest, Lynda Guttenberg, People Business Partner and Wellbeing Lead for the UK at Ericsson, will be in discussion about Ericsson's strategy 5Gs to Great Wellbeing and new wellbeing challenges in the time of COVID-19. In part three, myself and our other special guest, Dr. Wolfgang Seidl of Mercer, will be in discussion about taking a strategic, evidence-based approach to well-being and the implications of COVID-19 for well-being. Finally, in part four, you all will have the opportunity to ask questions and share experiences. You can do this by simply asking the question or using the chat area, which we will keep an eye on. Please do introduce yourself before you contribute. Just your name and organization will do. And now, without further ado, let's get started. Sorry, everyone, bear with me. I'm just minimizing my screen. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing some of the findings from our new research report, Let's Get Beyond Physical, Crafting a Multidimensional Approach to Wellbeing. I will also assess their relevance in light of COVID-19. There are three key messages to take away from this research. Number one, many organizations are neglecting their people's financial well-being. Number two, too few organizations are strategic in their approach to well-being. And number three, organizations must take a more systemic approach to well-being. Our first key finding is that people's financial well-being is being neglected in many organizations. Poor financial well-being costs UK employers about £1.5 billion annually through absenteeism and presenteeism. Yet only 44% of organizations are targeting their people's financial well-being, compared to 78% targeting mental well-being. Given the links between financial, mental, and physical health, it's no good to address one or two of these dimensions without the other. Financial well-being is neglected largely because there is less understanding of the role financial worries play in well-being as compared to the role of poor mental health, and in how that can impact performance. Many organizations are also hesitant to get too involved in employees' financial well-being, often due to confusion between financial education and financial advice, and the associated organizational responsibility and risk. This is complicated by the fact that many providers of financial education are less than altruistic and may even structure their education to point to their own financial advice, which is, after all, where the money is made. Marks and Spencer ran into such a problem. Having identified a need for improved financial literacy among their people, they found that financial education providers either pointed to their own products or assumed a certain level of financial competence. M&S decided to build their own financial education targeted at the level and needs of their people. Because a resource is no good if you don't know where to find it or how to use it, M&S is looking at how to embed the resource into their line manager toolkit and training. Post-COVID-19, many will be struggling financially in what is likely to be an unprecedented global downturn. We do not yet know the depth or breadth of the coming recession, but we can be sure that people will need financial education, advice, and support more than ever before. With many organizations considering or implementing pay cuts and annual reviews and pay rises on pause or suspended, access to knowledge and resources that support financial well-being will be an employee essential. Already in our discussions with HRDs, we are seeing evidence of increased need around financial well-being. For example, financial distress-related calls to EAPs are increasing, and some organizations are being caught off guard. The second key finding is that organizations need to be more strategic in their approach to well-being. They must be if they want well-being initiatives to positively impact business outcomes. It's not about adopting an app and considering it job done. Rather, business goals and an understanding of the workforce must determine well-being strategy and its associated interventions. This involves answering some key questions. Number one, what is the business strategy? What is the unique context of the business? What are its goals and objectives? Number two, what's the current health profile of the workforce? What are the needs among different employee groups? What's important to whom in the organization and why? Only 26% of organizations consistently or often use workforce data to drive decisions about investments in well-being. Number three, what activities and interventions are needed? This should be decided only after the health profile of the workforce is assessed. And number four, are there processes in place to evaluate and evolve the well-being strategy? Evaluation is a weak point for many organizations. 32% of employers are evaluating the effectiveness of their initiatives consistently or often. One example of taking a more strategic approach comes from Shell. At Shell, social isolation, it's a bit of a tongue twister, at Shell, social isolation, and language and cultural barriers make mental health a particular challenge for colleagues who work offshore in safety-critical environments as compared to those in offices. In response to the unique needs of this group, the company decided to create a 4-module training course with input from the seafarers that focuses on building resilience and having effective conversations around mental health. The intervention has been successful, especially in building social cohesion, and Shell has made the course freely available to the wider shipping industry. COVID-19 offers a good opportunity to assess or reassess the health profile of workforces, as the pandemic will have deeply affected them. As just one example, grief in its many varieties for lost loved ones, projects, meaning, time, will suddenly be experienced on a mass scale. What knowledge and resources does the organization have to help a large portion of their workforce remain productive and engaged whilst simultaneously grieving? The final key takeaway is about being more systemic. Organizations often take an overly medicalized approach to well-being, particularly regarding mental health. That is, applying a medical solution to what are essentially non-medical problems. Mental health first aid and referrals for counseling are helpful and appropriate in many cases, but in many other cases, the sources of stress and anxiety originate in the organization itself. In short, there is too much focus on helping sick individuals rather than building healthy organizations. By taking a systemic approach, we believe employers can prevent many problems before they start. CRF's model, the 5 pillars of organization self-care, is comprised of senior leaders, line managers, the culture, physical environment, and the nature of work. By leveraging these 5 pillars, we argue that employers can create a healthy organization in which most individuals, managers, and teams can thrive most of the time. The first pillar is senior leaders. Senior leaders' role is about visibility and accountability. They set the tone, can start, sustain, and destigmatize conversations about well-being, and can depressurize the work environment. At VTT, the Finnish Center for Research and Innovation, senior leaders are highly visible and accountable to well-being. One practice is showing your face, that is, using yourself as an example, such as when a senior leader was very open about her experiences with burnout. At leadership days, the top 250 leaders gather to talk about the business. Well-being priorities are always discussed at these sessions and then cascaded. In some parts of the business, senior leaders have incorporated well-being as a standard part of business meetings. And at the annual Gala of Failures, senior leaders share mistakes they've made and the lessons learned. The gala isn't strictly about well-being, but it has featured as a topic. With COVID-19, senior leaders will need to be or quickly become highly effective communicators, sharing relevant messages. Transparency about the state of the business, authenticity and their own feelings about the situation, role modeling good self-care, emphasizing adaptability, and encouraging people to set boundaries are especially important. HR will need to identify and get those leaders who are especially effective communicators out front, look for opportunities to help others who are less skilled learn from them. The next pillar is line managers. Line managers are key enablers of or barriers to their people's well-being. They need the hard skills of good management, the soft skills of empathy and emotional intelligence, and the confidence to recognize signs of mental and financial struggle and signpost relevant resources. Post-COVID-19, effective remote management will be a key issue. Line managers will need support not only in how to manage remote workers to do their jobs, but how to support their well-being from a distance. Setting and respecting boundaries, cultivating space for the social, over-communicating, and more frequent check-ins are some practices that we are already seeing emphasized. Pillar number 3 in the model is the nature of work. By nature of work, we mean the conditions and features of a job that make it more meaningful, manageable, and rewarding. Unsurprisingly, jobs that are purposeful, fairly remunerated, have high autonomy and control, opportunities to learn and grow, flexibility, and the opportunity to have one's voice heard are likely to be more attractive for more people more often than those that are not. CERN, the particle physics laboratory, is a good example of bringing these elements, the nature of work and the key role of line managers, together. Comprised of a cross-functional team and in response to a directive from the Director General, the Work Well, Feel Well project addresses rising levels of occupational stress in the organization. CERN recognizes that work is good for health, but working conditions are key. So they've taken a preventative approach. The focus is on good job design and good management standards, more job control, the ability to adjust workloads, extensive line manager training, and learning interventions for everyone on resilience. CERN is also working to harmonize systems and tools to better diagnose problems, collaborate, and evolve solutions. Post-COVID-19, the conditions of work have radically changed. New constraints will limit what is possible. For example, consider flexibility. COVID-19 has ushered in remote working, and many organizations are finding that they've adapted better than expected. But what will the long-term settlement around remote working look like? It's very unlikely we'll go back to before, but all remote all the time may be too extreme for most organizations. Employers will have to consider their needs, issues of fairness, and employee choice when designing policies around the conditions of work in the future. Organization culture is the 4th pillar. Organization culture and employee well-being are closely linked. Put simply, most employees struggle in demanding, hostile, and conflict-ridden cultures. Rather, those that are socially supportive, inclusive, and collaborative enable well-being. Post-COVID-19, the methods for achieving such a culture will vary. How do we collaborate, socially support, and include one another at a distance? In some ways, creating these conditions remotely may be easier. Technologies such as Zoom are enabling more collaboration and often have an informal air. Breaking down barriers, us colleagues literally take a peek inside each other's homes and lives. Organizations are being intentional and creative in creating virtual spaces for socializing. We've heard of pub quizzes, cocktail hours, virtual coffee catch-ups, colleague-led yoga classes, and dedicated social time at the beginning of business meetings. Inclusivity is likely to be a challenge. Employers will want to pay attention to who is getting included and who is left out. One of my favorite examples from the research comes from John Lewis. They have something called a random coffee break, where you get in touch with HR and you say, I just want to meet somebody completely different. They assign you and you go off with this person on a coffee break and learn about each other in the business. It strikes me that this random coffee break is something that could be easily adapted in a remote environment and creates a real opportunity. It's a great way to form diverse bonds among your people. Finally, the 5th pillar in our model is the physical environment. In the report, we argue that a physical working environment that is safe, comfortable, and accommodating is essential to employee well-being. Not so long ago, this meant getting the basics of natural light, good ventilation, and comfortable temperatures right. Post-COVID-19, safety, in a way we've never conceptualized it before, will be everyone's top concern. Already in countries such as China, an emerging issue is whether people are willing to return to the workplace. Some are very excited to do so, I know I am, but others are frightened of the risks. With some form of social distancing likely here to stay for the long term, workplaces will have to be reconfigured for safety and hygiene with attention not only to physical, but also to psychological aspects of well-being. One lesson from the research is to involve employees in decisions about their physical environment. As much as possible, tap into their creativity and let them take ownership of projects that improve the space. I'd like to close with 3 suggestions for what to do differently. Number 1, get financial well-being on the radar. Assess employees' needs, audit current provision, and adjust accordingly. Consider using free and impartial resources, such as the UK government's Money Advice Service. Number 2, use data to build a picture of the health profile of your workforce. Tailor well-being interventions to different groups and their needs, and evaluate the outcomes. And number 3, be systemic. Help sick individuals, yes, but build a healthy organization too. Make senior leaders accountable and visible. Train line managers in hard skills, soft skills, and how to signpost. Build an inclusive, socially supportive, collaborative culture. Make sure the physical environment is safe, comfortable, and accommodating, and design work that is purposeful, flexible, and rewarding. So that is a whistle-stop tour of our report's findings. And I should ask, has Lynda been able to join us? Athena.
Hi, this is Lynda speaking.
Hi, great, Lynda. Thank you. I wasn't sure when I started speaking. So I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to the call. One of the key takeaways from the research is that organizations have to be more strategic in their approach to well-being. You can't just adopt an app and say job done. One of the things that I find really compelling about your work at Ericsson is that an app plays an important role in your well-being strategy, but that you have been so intentional and strategic about how you've used it. So before we talk about the strategy itself, 5 Gs to great well-being, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the context at Ericsson in which the strategy has evolved.
Okay, no problem. Firstly, sorry about not being on video. Technical difficulties with using Zoom. It's blocked. Okay. So I joined Ericsson in April 2018, and when I joined the organization, we were just coming out of a global reorganization and downsizing program, and there was still a small number of exits taking place in 2018. Just before I joined in March 2018, the organization for the UK had also taken the decision to relocate our offices from Guildford to Reading in order to be in closer proximity to our clients and future talent pools in terms of, Reading University, closer access to London and so on. We moved offices in October 2018. So the focus in 2018 was very much more around culture change. With the office move came new ways of working, greater flexibility to work between office and home, more collaboration sites within the office space, no assigned desks, rather team areas where you could come and sit to work with your team. Obviously, people are a bit creatures of habits, and you do find people regularly sitting at the same desks. And then in view of my day-to-day role as a business partner, I became familiar with a number of resources that we have in place, that a lot of companies have in place, like Employee Assistance Program, occupational health services, but these were not too easy to find. So one of the first things I suggested when joining was to create, to centralize our resources and create a UK Wellbeing Hub. And in review of our resources, it kind of became apparent to me that we could be doing more on the mental well-being front, particularly if you reflect back in the UK in 2017, there was a lot of reporting in the news and media around suicide rates, particularly amongst men. And sadly, within Ericsson in the UK, in our field service operations organization, we did have a suicide towards the end of 2018. So there just became a key driver from a business perspective to improve well-being support for our employees, but also for our managers. So in late 2018, I did start to look at mental health first aiders, for example, and I started to notice a bit of a trend amongst senior leaders talking about mindfulness. And so started looking at apps, things like Headspace, as well as Thrive Therapeutics.
Right. And so then you've evolved on the back of that, your 5 Gs to great well-being. Can you tell us a little bit about the components of the strategy and some of the activities that you've undertaken to support those components?
Sure. So it's probably worth noting that I didn't actually launch the strategy until November 2019. I opted to start building engagement through starting with events in the first place. But when you look back at the strategy, each of those events are aligned to a pillar within the strategy. And another reason for me delaying, the reason I'm sharing this is it's not so easy to just create a strategy and launch it to the business. I wanted to make it meaningful to the workplace and tangible in some way. So one of our key technologies within the mobile technology industry is 5G. So that is where the 5Gs to Great Wellbeing came from. And I created 5 pillars, so physical, mental, social, financial, and community well-being. Each has a strapline that starts with G, and then there's a description. I do have it in front of me, not that I can show you, but just to give you an example of one of the pillars. So you've got physical well-being, and then it goes get exercising and eating healthy. And then the description below is being active and healthy keeps our body strong and improves our mental well-being, which helps our focus, performance, sleep, energy levels, and our quality life. And each pillar has that sort of strapline and that description below. So in January 2019, in the lead up, I suppose, to creating the strategy and launching that in November, I started with a small on-site event, you know, the whole New Year, New Me concept, you know, that often happens in January with everybody's New Year's resolution. So we brought on some benefits providers and nutrition advice. Then in April, I launched a dedicated inbox and the UK Wellbeing Yammer group, like an office social media platform. In May, we did our first walking challenge because in the UK, May is the National Walking Month, and there's also the Mental Health Awareness Week in May, and last year's theme was body image. So did a little activity to promote positive body image within our lives. And in August 2019, I actually launched the UK Wellbeing Hub. And then in September is when we had what we call our People Day event, which is to promote our people first philosophy, so like our employee value proposition, promoting things like talent management, career development, personal development, had various benefits providers on site, and we also launched Thrive, our mental well-being app. And then in November, as I said, I mentioned I launched the strategy, but I also shared the 2019 action plan to sort of bring it all together. People had heard and been involved in different well-being activities during the course of the year, and each of those activities were then aligned to a pillar within the strategy. And I looked beyond what was being driven within the people function, because we have a social committee, we have a team that looks at step into STEM, and I pulled that all into the action plan to create visibility of what's going on across the workplace, supporting our well-being. And then I also, at the same time, I shared our 2020 action plan, with the caveat, of course, that it's subject to review and change, just because things can shift over time. So that's kind of how I got to the strategy and what we've done so far in 2019. And I'll 2020, I suppose, has focused more on COVID-19 in terms of mental well-being support related to the pandemic.
Yes, so we'll return to the question of COVID-19 in just a minute, but I like a couple of the points that you made there about sort of communicating it, bringing it all together, making it relevant to people, and also looking beyond just, you know, to see what's going on throughout the organization. In the report, we talk about supporting practices for well-being, and that resonates. So as I mentioned, one of the things that I really like about your work is the way you've approached using an app. So many companies throw an app at the problem, but again, you've been really intentional in how you've leveraged the app. So could you tell us about the app that you're using to support well-being and how you've leveraged that?
Yes, certainly. So as I mentioned, there was a trend to referencing mindfulness and the benefits of mindfulness in 2018, and I started to look at various apps, and I had actually worked with Thrive Therapeutics in the past, so I went back to revisit what the app included, just to see if there were changes since I'd last used it. And one of the key draw cards for me with this app is that it's an NHS accredited app. For anybody not in the UK, NHS is the National Health Service in the UK, and there are various hoops to jump through to get accredited by them as an app. Let Thrive talk for themselves on that point, but that is what they are, and they share and promote key techniques to support mindfulness, but they go beyond that. They also support cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, which is really good for helping you reframe negative thinking, which is particularly good for anxiety and depression. So those were the key reasons why I started to look at Thrive with greater interest. And then in talking with them, you get monthly, and which we do now, get monthly metrics. So you get to see how many people across the business have downloaded the app, what the numbers are that are using the app, and then you get trends in terms of key areas of concerns for employees using that. Now, obviously, it's just a snapshot because you're not getting trends from across the business. It's just individuals using the app, but it still gives you an indication of some of the concerns, and it also gives you positive trends as well. And metrics are autonomized, and usage is confidential, so we don't know who's actually using the app at any time. And a key thing for me about Thrive has been that they have become very much a mental well-being partner. Even from the start, it was never just about the app. It was always about how the app could be a tool within the wider mental well-being program. So I've discussed with them, the pros and cons of going with mental health first aiders versus mental health champions. We did go with mental health champions just with regards to how we wanted to position that network within the organization, and rolling out mental health support training. And Thrive supported both of those initiatives within the organization. And since then, they've done a number of on-site events to help improve visibility, interest, and engagement. And all of those activities are all about helping to start the conversation to help people engage and normalize with mental health. And this year, we did start to look at, before the pandemic, we did start to look at putting on bespoke events driven by interest within the business. So we put on a graduate event focusing on the difficulties and challenges transitioning from university to work. And then building team resilience was requested by a team of senior managers. And I'm due to have a conversation with them in a couple of weeks about a schedule of events for the rest of the year, which will probably be webinar based, depending on how unlocking lockdown goes. We may get an opportunity to do face-to-face towards the end of the year. But yeah, they very much have had regular conversations about what we can be doing within our organization to better support the well-being of our employees. And the app can be used by our, now we've rebranded them, our well-being champions, as a signposting tool for when they're having conversations with people for seeking support. They can also use the tool themselves. We've actually got access to the Thrive coaches. So that's a chat function service whereby you can chat with somebody within the app. And that's actually a good point point to flag. I really actually like that functionality within the app, because not everybody is comfortable picking up a phone and speaking to somebody about their problems, particularly when you, not wanting to generalize, but younger demographics do tend to favor chatting with people. And we also have a big proportion of our employees who are out in the field, and a male demographic who may not always want to speak with people. So adding this other option in terms of being able to chat with people, I thought was quite a good thing. So I've actually recently had feedback from my colleague that supports the FSO, that she saw a comment within a web conversation about how we're doing mental well-being well. So we've, I can't put everything on one comment, but certainly the feedback that I'm getting from on the ground is that people feel like they have the resources and they're getting the communication and support. You can't suddenly stop promoting. Obviously, this is an ongoing journey, but yeah, that's. I'll stop talking now.
Well, thank you, Lynda. Thank you for sharing that story. Like I said, I really like that it's not just, oh, there's an app available. It's so much. There's so much more. I'd like to ask a question of the audience really quickly here. I'm just going to post it into the chat now. We'd be interested to know what one critical well-being issue has emerged at your organization during the pandemic. So I just sent that out into the chat. Please do let us know. And Lynda, that brings you and I back to this topic of COVID-19. And so our final question, just really quickly, everything we've discussed, like you said, was already in action. So can you tell us about a few, or the one well-being challenge that's emerged during the pandemic for you at Ericsson, and how you're addressing it?
I suppose that would be moving to remote working. So we didn't just switch to remote working. It was a transitional as the organization assessed the risk of COVID-19. We reduced business travel, then stopped business travel. Then the decision was taken that anybody that was non-essential for being in the office was to move to remote working. And then there was a lot of global, or there is a lot of global content produced around supporting remote working and how to deal with being in a pandemic situation. But locally, I also then needed to add content to the UK Wellbeing Hub for remote working. Tips, guidance, encouragement to exercise. I did a briefing note on balancing homeschooling versus home working. So there was a lot of shift change. Some people are quite comfortable with home working, and other people have found it quite challenging. So it was to try to give them guidance around that point. And I would also come back to Thrive and mental well-being, because there's been a big impact on employees' mental well-being in the pandemic situation, both from stress, anxiety, the difficulties and challenges of being in this very unusual situation. And they have put on for their partners, so not specific for Ericsson, but all employees could access it if they wanted to, a range of webinars from stress to remote working and social distancing, anxiety and unsettling times. And they've had quite an array of support topics that have been recorded, and that content we've now added to the mental health support page. So I guess the two key takeaways was the shift change to remote working for a large number of people, and then the mental well-being support for everybody within a pandemic situation. And even our colleagues out in the field services have had to continue to be out there to support the mobile network. And they've had to get used to, using PPE and their own challenges with their mental well-being. So those would be the things that I'd say we've had to adapt to.
Thank you, Lynda. Just keeping an eye on the chat, I see a lot of that sort of resonating, that remote working, particularly social isolation around that, and the balance, especially if you have children, the risk of burnout, right? Because we're all sort of always on now, in a way, or there's the risk of that. So thank you, Lynda, very much for your time. I think you're able to stay on the call for our question portion in about 10 or 15 minutes, correct?
Yes, that's fine.
So great, thank you. So for now, we'll turn to Wolfgang. Thank you for joining us, Wolfgang. For everyone on the call, Wolfgang is a psychiatrist and partner and workplace health solutions leader at Mercer Marsh Benefits. Wolfgang, in the research report, we talk about the importance of taking a data-driven approach to well-being, but we find that companies are still pretty inconsistent about doing this, whether that's in terms of using data to drive strategic choices or in the evaluation of outcomes. Can you tell us why is it important that companies take an evidence-based approach, and what are some of the barriers that typically prevent them from doing so?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Carmen, and welcome everybody to our conversation about health and well-being. I think the data-driven question is at the heart of it all, because most organizations incur high costs for the treatment of employees who suffer from ill health, and that's measured in insurance premiums going up, but also in terms of productivity, which again you measure normally by looking at absence and presenteeism. But only those claims ratios and absenteeism are visible, and they tend to be a proportion of just 5 to 25% of the workforce, but attract most of the cost. So companies, in my experience, don't invest enough or invest nothing at all in the health of the remaining 75 to 95%. So the main reason for that is that employers don't know anything about this population's health needs unless they have services in place like Lynda just described, or you have health risk assessment tools in place. But therefore, they manage this very significant business risk sort of blindly, and yet investing in well-being makes a lot of business sense. While sickness incurs high treatment costs, maintaining well-being is usually much more cost-effective. An investment strategy of maintaining good health avoids the otherwise natural progression of a significant proportion of the employee population from low health risk to medium risk, high risk, and ultimately being the claimants of tomorrow, which then incurs a high cost through productivity loss and absenteeism and presenteeism underneath that. So why wouldn't you base it on data and insights? If you just take it to the current situation when we are coming out of lockdown, what we really want to achieve is to base it on data insights rather than just making assumptions and flying blindly. So science is suddenly, again at the focal point of our considerations. And it's not really that difficult to glean the data. I mean, it's not rocket science. Even the concept of presenteeism that sometimes is considered a bit difficult to grasp is not that difficult to measure. But most importantly, you have your health insurance data, your sickness absence data, your long-term disability or income protection data, occupational health, health risk assessments, health screenings, employee assistance programs have been mentioned today, and surveys. While you wouldn't have all of that, but you would have at least 3 data sets that you can triangulate and then get meaningful data from it. So I think we are sort of on the verge of moving into sort of more evidence-based practice in health and well-being at work, because the anecdotal evidence-based stuff had its day, and we have seen in this unfortunate crisis we are in that we need hard facts.
Yes, thank you. And can you tell us what are some of the hallmarks of a strategic evidence-based approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's a few points that I would like to highlight. So firstly, it should be, whatever you do should be strategically aligned as a framework. So a framework that is cognizant of the connections between health, performance, and demographics, or D&I. So to make it, to exemplify it, we want to know, for instance, how does a young woman fare, say, after a good performance review? Does her health improve, deteriorate, or stay the same over the next few months? Correlations show that health can be a lagging indicator, as it's not always performance deteriorating after a health event, but it can be the other way around, that a bad performance review can lead to deteriorating health a few months later, as I said, as a lagging indicator for various reasons that we could discuss. But that is a joined up framework, at least between health, performance, and D&I aspects. The other point I would make is that we need to conceptualize human beings as a holistic entity and not keep building hospitals or interventions for bodies without souls and others for hospitals for brains without bodies. So our health care strategy should have at least a biopsychosocial plus financial well-being elements to it. So there's a few more if you wanted to drill down, as you have put in your report so wisely, you know, the environmental aspects, the occupational well-being, spiritual well-being in the sense of purpose and trust, and all that was mentioned by Lynda before as well, at least indirectly. So that's the holistic understanding of our employees' needs. But then also we want evidence-based interventions such as effective health pathways with measurable outcomes. We can't afford any longer to pay for services that have no outcome. I mean, everyone talks about return on investment or value on investment, but first of all, we need to be clear that the tools in our box are sharp enough to make a difference. So we measure clinical parameters as well as economic ones. And it's not rocket science again. Suppliers should be able to measure outcomes, but we find that we often have to persuade them or to tell them to do so, to give you the evidence or that they have to do it. I think also culture has been mentioned many times, and we could have a whole session on that, but embedding your health and well-being practices into the overall organizational culture is so important. And just look at the concepts of good work or work life. And when I looked at the responses to your question, it was so much about work-life balance. It was so much about switching off and remote working and differentiating between what is work and what is home life. So organizational culture is important, and obviously the leadership example is part of that. And last but not least, what comes to mind here also is to sort of go back deeper into the D&I discourse. So I sometimes say that health and well-being is a new frontier in the D&I discourse, highlighting personalization of approaches, but also intersectionality. I mean, I don't need to share with this group, it's pretty evident. Men and women use healthcare services very differently. Older and younger employees have different needs. BAME employees have different needs, and we are still targeting everybody with our health campaigns in the same way, even though the epidemiology is quite different for various diseases, chronic diseases as well, in different age groups and ethnic groups. And then you have all the data showing that LGBTQ plus employees have different needs, and then neurodiversity like Asperger's or autistic spectrum, to mention just one, you know, and that is linked, of course, to office layout again. So when we talk about the modern smart office now and the desk sharing, etc., it may be good for 90% of your staff, but there are some people who just need a certain environment, and that would certainly appeal to somebody on the spectrum I just mentioned. And also it depends very much on personality types as well. So the big discussion about working from home is also a discussion about, if you like to make it quite snappy, a discussion between introverts and extroverts, because the former might relish opportunities they have working from home, whereas the latter really miss bouncing off ideas from others. And we heard great examples of how you can use social networking and media and creative ideas from Lynda to feed this need of our extrovert employees. But I think the point I'm making is that that D&I is indeed, part of the discourse here.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's something we came across in the research, where often well-being came out of health and safety, you know, a generation ago, but now so many more of us are working in offices. It's a different scheme, and joining up with D&I, having these two agendas joined up, seems to be very much the way it's going to go in the future. And I like your point about introverts and extroverts. That came up in the research as well, you know, especially back in the day when we were all in offices and we'd have collaboration spaces and open office plans, which are great for extroverts, but maybe not so great, exhausting for introverts, I say, as an introvert. So can I ask you, we have to go back to COVID-19, of course, it's front of everyone's mind right now. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the well-being challenges that you're seeing in your work that organizations are having as a result of the virus.
Yeah.
A little bit about it, work-life balance, but.
Yes, huge challenges that have been mentioned before. I mean, a lot to do with remote working as well. And then let's not forget, not everybody falls into that group. I have given many presentations to organizations that had to continue working in the field, so to speak, so let's not forget that. Also, my medical colleagues, once we come out of that crisis, everyone is predicting some type of mental health challenge, not too dissimilar to people, and it's an overused comparison, not too dissimilar to people returning from a war zone. So some of it bordering on post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's various aspects to it. So there's not just the returning to the office piece, but also I think what we have seen is that employers who acted swiftly to allow people to work from home, to keep them safe before they were ordered to do so by government, would have enhanced the culture of the organization by making people feel like they really mattered. And similarly, employers who perhaps weren't prioritizing well-being as much as they could have in the past now have a unique opportunity to shift the culture of the organization and focus on to what really matters, and that's health. And when you do surveys amongst employees, you always find that well-being and sort of satisfaction in life is, people always say health is most important, particularly mental health, but quickly after that they say work. So I have often been quoted of saying, happiness means being able to work and able to love, because that's the other way of talking about work-life balance that is probably more appropriate than just quantifying each and every aspect. So I think employers that want to harness this now, this opportunity, must start by showing the caring face of the organization and re-engineering workplaces around human needs instead of continuing to ask people to fit their lives around work. So some things may never return to so-called normal, with elements of flexible working definitely here to stay. And perhaps more importantly, questions around purpose and meaning of work will be posed more and more. And we see in organizations where purpose is really strong in the employee value proposition, that you have usually higher engagement, higher productivity, a better sense of belonging. And it's really important. So in practice, that means that I think the impact of the coronavirus crisis on mental health on the workforce cannot be underestimated, even though, some data is contradictory. You had this wonderful study from Sheffield University showing us that during the crisis, when the lockdown started, that anxiety disorder and depression rates more or less doubled. But on the other hand, you don't see the same increased demand in EAPs, but that has been seen before in crises like that people are holding back a bit from getting their needs met and across, because people are quite altruistic actually by default and feeling that other people have bigger problems than they have. But we expect all those calls and inquiries to shoot up once we are coming out of the worst of the crisis, because people have been emotionally bruised by the prolonged period of isolation and juggling homeschooling with work, etc. So I think there's a number of questions that people will be asking themselves, and the most important ones is, how can I keep people safe when we return to work? Or do people have realistic targets? So that plays to the HSE standards of stress, what I'm alluding to here. Or are they allowed to have some control over their workflow, as they are to some degree having now when they are working remotely? Do they have the opportunity to take breaks and exercise and eat well? And a number of those questions. And do they have opportunity to use their key strength at work every day? Do they have a chance to reach their full potential, or at least get close to it? And is there flexibility to meet their needs that they have also outside work? So there's a number of things that I could go into, but I'm cognizant of time passing.
Yes. Well, thank you, Wolfgang. So just to recap a few of the things that I've been thinking as you've been talking, the future of well-being and post-COVID-19, we're going to see more of a move from anecdote to data, more joining up with diversity and inclusion, recognizing the importance of that. The crisis provides a unique opportunity to change your culture, shift your conversations, do things differently, understand your workforce differently. And obviously issues, because there will be more remote working here to stay, dealing with well-being issues related specifically to that. And then finally, getting prepared to react to the trauma that your entire workforce is going to bring back with it, having gone through this experience. So no small order for everyone dealing with well-being in the future. So I'm very cognizant we have about 9 minutes left, so maybe we can take 8 of those minutes for questions from the audience for Wolfgang, Lynda, myself, and I will look and see if there's anything in the chat. But also, if anybody just wants to pop themselves off mute and ask a question, please feel free to do so. Very quiet. Looking for a question in the chat. I can come up with one if nobody else has one.
I had a question for Wolfgang. I was interested in the work that you're doing with organisations, and you talk about this move towards more data-driven, I like the phrase anecdote to data. Are there any particularly good examples of organisations that you're seeing that you'd be able to share?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I'm thinking what is in the public domain. I mean, if you look at the REBA Awards, for instance, one of my clients won the REBA Award for Best Global Wellbeing Strategy last year. And the approach that was taken was to use all the data sets I mentioned before and create a dashboard inside, because when you look at absence data, you will assume that you need a flu vaccination program. If you look at healthcare data, it looks like musculoskeletal is the most important. And when you ultimately look at long-term disability, then mental health has overtaken musculoskeletal. So if you look at data sets in isolation, there you will get a lopsided strategy. So only by cross-referencing them, you get the real trend. So they did that in a number of key countries where they're operating. And then we developed a global health and well-being strategy, and then implementations like, mental health pathways, which have a proactive and a reactive angle, and then also musculoskeletal or maternity care, whatever comes out on top in various geographies. And yes, there are outcome studies as well. I'm thinking of another organization that did a mental health pathway and found that they reduced their mental health claims by 9%, average cost by 16%, therapy outcomes improved by 60%, absence by 41%. So yes, you can follow it through then, but it's all anonymized aggregate data, of course. And honestly, it sounds dry, but I mean, I'm a medic, but I also studied ROI at business school. I really enjoy this journey of discovery. It is like an epidemiologist. You are like a Sherlock Holmes of medicine. You are looking for the connections and so on. And what you ultimately discover as well is that pure medical intervention is not everything. You need culture and communication as much as you need the pure medical intervention. And I think in Carmen's wonderful report, there is a chapter also on the medicalization hypothesis and how that has not always served us as well as it could have. So I stopped there, but trust me, data can be interesting.
Thank you, Wolfgang. There's a question here for Lynda in the chat. Lynda, did you change your health and well-being comms strategy to more digital or otherwise due to COVID-19, and how?
I would say yes. So from a corporate perspective, and a global perspective, the CEO has provided regular communications to the business to provide information and updates about how we are seeking to support our employees and our clients through the pandemic. We've taken a very, I suppose, employee-centric approach to ensure the health and well-being of our employees. And email has been a key communication tool, but from a local UK perspective, I have done what I call like a quarterly review of well-being activities in the first quarter, and then used the UK Wellbeing Yammer Group, but also utilizing my colleagues in the People Business Partner team to speak with their team leaders and drive communications through their respective team meetings. So everything is now done virtually and online, rather than, of course, the face-to-face option is removed for the time being anyway, unless you go for video calls.
Thank you, Lynda. Another question from the chat, which Wolfgang, I'd be interested to have your view on, is given that cash is king at the moment and organizations are holding on to money, how do you deliver this cost effectively but comprehensively?
Great question, because no better question but challenge us as consultants. I think if cash is very tight, and it has always been, let's be honest anyway, I think line managers are key to the whole story. So if you haven't spoken to your line managers yet, and it's not part of their core competencies, perhaps line manager training is something that can be delivered very cost effectively, particularly now as nobody insists on face-to-face anymore, so you can deliver it very scalably online. So line manager training to discharge your duty of care, but also be cognizant of the right referral routes, is a fantastic tool, giving managers also empathy skills and resiliency skills at the same time. So that's a place where I would start. And otherwise, in terms of data, if you don't have the bandwidth right now because you're very busy to pull it all together in a dashboard and you don't want to ask somebody else to do it for you, I think one can become a little bit more demanding with one's carriers and providers, because they do have good data, but they need a bit of persuading to put the data in the right format and to give you meaningful reports. We don't need big data, we need meaningful data.
Thank you. There's one more question actually here for you specifically, Wolfgang, in the chat. Will giving employees choice and a feeling of being in control help? With such a personalized approach, how can businesses still collaborate cohesively and deliver their purpose?
Yeah, well, that sounds like a paradox, but all the psychological research over many decades shows that feeling a locus of control inside of yourself rather than being micromanaged is what buys you more engagement and more sense of belonging, and hence more productivity. At no stage would I ever advocate that people become their own managers. The needs must, and there is a pragmatism attached to that statement. So I think it's really just where I can have control over my workflow to the degree that is appropriate to my level of work and what I'm doing. That sense of control helps, because it's no good if people are doing stuff that they are not invested in. And the research that many of you have seen also that Google did on psychological safety, I think bears evidence of that as well, that if you give people that psychological safety that you can bring your good ideas to work without fear of reprisal or being ridiculed, actually those teams have exceeded targets by 17%. So it's a way of doing it, I think, that is important here.
Thank you. So I'm going to just squeeze in one last question before we get to our goodbyes. From the chat, from Mark Minery at the Bank of England. And Lynda, I'd like to ask you this one. The question is, how do firms best support those staff who don't want to work from home and the impact on their well-being? So I'm interested, is this an issue that you've come across at Ericsson, people who are not happy to work from home, and how are you approaching that?
Yes, I mean, there have been a small number of individuals who've come forward to say that they either don't have the setup to work from home, or it's not their preference. But we do have to remind people that due to the current pandemic situation, that flexibility to go back into the office takes that out of our hands to some extent. Certainly when it comes back to looking at phasing people into the office, we are going to be taking a cautious approach with small numbers and critical roles going back first. But where there are individuals who feel that their mental well-being is being impacted by working from home, we will probably review those on a case-by-case basis to enable them to go into the office. I wouldn't say 5 days per week, but a couple of days per week. So there is scope to improve the situation in the longer term, but in the interim, you know, it is around asking managers to have those regular one-to-one conversations and to help improve the engagement and experience for the individual who may feel isolated by the fact that they're not at home. And of course, if somebody, and this is a bit subject to what their home space is like, if they did have a particular health and safety need for a chair or something, of course we would provide that. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all. It would come down to what support that can be put in place to better improve that person's experience whilst there isn't that flexibility to come back into the office. And then when we are able to start looking to phasing back into the office, can we provide them with some flexibility to help improve their working experience until we get to that stage where we're back in the office, which will probably be quite some time away.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you, Lynda. That's really insightful. I'm very cognizant that we are 1 minute over time, so I'm going to say thank you, Lynda. Thank you, Wolfgang, for joining us. Thank you, everyone on the call today. Please note that this content will be made available on demand as part of our post-meeting notes, which will be distributed shortly. If you have any feedback for the session, please let Athena know at athena@crforum.co.uk. And finally, you may have noticed that we didn't talk too much about resilience and individual responsibility for well-being today. That's because the topic gets its very own Zoom coming up on June 10th at 12 p.m. So please do join us for that if you are interested. And thank you again all for your time.
Thank you.